Hello, everyone. This is Brian Daitzman, editor-in-chief of The Intellectualist and host of History of the Present, a long-form interview series co-produced by The Intellectualist and Lincoln Square. At History of the Present, we are examining the major forces that are reshaping our world in real time, including democracy, technology, climate change, institutional power, inequality, migration, and the future of American public life. Today, I am joined by Michael Hiltzik, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, longtime business columnist for Los Angeles Times, and the author of Golden State, The Making of a California, a book that we're going to be discussing today. Michael has written for the Los Angeles Times for more than 40 years. In 1999, he and his colleague Chuck Phillips shared the Pulitzer Prize for articles exposing corruption in the entertainment industry. Golden State, Mr. Hiltzik's book, traces California's history from Spanish incursions into what was called Alta California through the gold rush, railroads, water development, political reform, Hollywood, sort of the social conflict, environmental conservation, and the rise of big tech, all the things that we know of from history and current events. It's also a history of California's unique influence on the United States and of the contradictions beneath the state's own mythology. Michael, thank you for joining me. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. And thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this.
Of course. Michael, I really want to begin with Golden State, The Making of California. I want to ask you, what made you decide to write a comprehensive history of California at this point in your career? If you can just kind of speak to the sort of motivation in writing this book.
Right. Well, what I generally tell people who ask me that question is that I get interested in a topic. When I get interested in a certain topic and can't find enough that's already been written to satisfy my curiosity, it sort of triggers me to satisfy my curiosity myself, and that's how this book and several of my other books have sort of germinated. At this point, we came back to live in California in around 1991 after my wife and I and our two kids had been overseas for 8 years or so. So we came back. The boys were raised in California, and they are Californians, although they both left the state to be educated, though they could have stayed. So anyway, it had been a long time, or a fairly long time, since there was a one-volume comprehensive narrative history of California, and I looked to Kevin Starr, who wrote 7 volumes and then compiled them all into one volume. And before him, there was Carrie McWilliams, who wrote about every conceivable issue that involved California. But his main book was published in 1949. So I thought it was a good time to come back and actually take another look at what we know about California's history and put it in a modern context.
May I ask you, Michael, why does California seem to capture not only the American imagination, but also overseas? When people think of the United States, they tend to think of the Empire State Building and they think of the Hollywood sign. Can you speak to that a little?
Sure. This is a question that can be pretty hard to answer, except that we know that really, even since dating back to the conquistador period, there was a fascination for this part of the land that just drew people here. For Cortez, it was the stories that there was gold to be found here, and he didn't find it, but he was actually right, of course, as we later discovered. California, I think to a certain extent, first of all, it's so big and it's so varied that anybody looking for almost anything can find it here. It's also a part. One of the inspirations for the Transcontinental Railroad, the first Transcontinental Railroad, was concern in Washington that California was so far away that if the country didn't get its arms around it, it could even have joined the Confederacy in the run up to the Civil War. So that inspired, from the outsider's standpoint, the need for a railroad, and from the resident standpoint, they needed a way to reach markets for the produce that they had begun to raise in the Central Valley and the Imperial Valley and what have you. So that drew people here. That drew people's attention here. The state is so far away that you can, certainly in the old days, you could come here and remake your life. You could shed whatever disreputable past you had and start over again and find your fortune.
Which is a very American thing, right?
Well, it's an American thing, and it's, of course, a very Californian thing. And we're thinking about, 1848, 1849 with the discovery of gold. What I've written in the book is that you can sort of divide California's history into the pre-gold rush era and the post-gold rush era, because it was such a transformative thing. So anyway, there are all these factors that have drawn people here. And as I've written, California was the destination of three of the major migrations in American history, and it, including the gold rush, the building of California in the post-war years, and the search for real estate. And there were different reasons for all of these migrations, but what they shared was the dream of coming to California and starting over.
After tracing California from, let's say, the Spanish period through the rise of big tech, what is the central, if there was a central theory about California? And I know you sort of hesitate with that. What is this? What if there is a story about California at the highest level of abstraction? What could that story be?
Well, I think you could probably boil it down to the term self-sufficiency. Californians, people came here to California. The first American migrants, the colonists, really came here because they understood that there was just almost unlimited land to cultivate, land to raise, pasturing land and what have you, and just a tremendous promise of natural resources. And the people who came here, I think Joan Didion wrote about this, that they were not the layabouts and the stay-at-home. And California was wide open, but the promise was widely publicized and real. So people who came here really were looking to not only start over, but start things themselves. And that's what we see consistently, this urge to basically to create something new that can then be sent to the rest of the country and really to the rest of the world. And that's been a sort of a consistent thread in California history. And I might add, by the way, that, I wrote in my introduction, I think, that this book began with the theme of I'm going to write about what California has taught the world and the country. And in the course of doing the research, I recognize that not everything that California taught the world and the country, is something that we necessarily want the rest of the world and the rest of the country to know, because there were a lot of negative influences that began here or that were nurtured here that were spread nationwide and overseas.
Micah, you almost, I think you're reading my mind, because my next question was actually kind of about this. All right. How come what you see in California, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, usually filters through the rest of the country, maybe 25 years, eventually filters through the rest of the country? You said that sometimes it was negative, right? And I think, I don't know, during, I think, the 80s and 90s, if I recall, in the state of California, there was a lot of anti-immigrant bias that was, I think, very much a sort of, for at least the California Republicans of that era, They went sort of all in on that, if I recall correctly, and that sort of anti-immigration sort of nativism really, which we saw, it was very clear. I forget what the proposition was in California. I want to say
it was Proposition 187.
187. Okay, there you go.
1994, yeah.
1994, and there was this huge backlash. And from the literature I looked at, suggested that essentially the Republican Party, it had ebbs and valleys, but it never really recovered after that. Can you speak to that a little?
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely correct. Prop 187. Look, California, just as California's economy tends to vacillate between boom and bust, California politics have also vacillated between progressive values and non-progressive values. And we can go back in history and talk about the anti-Chinese movement in the 1880s, which got communicated to the rest of the country and ended up in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 82. The genocide against California's tribes in the 1860s, the anti-Japanese movement, which surfaced, it sort of followed on the anti-Chinese movement, but was, at the dawn of the 20th century. And in terms of Prop 187, we experienced sort of this wave of anti-immigrant fervor that was strong enough to get a anti-immigrant proposition passed, which would said illegal immigrants, bar them from public services. But we know who those people were thought to be. So it was really, it exposed legal and illegal immigrants and native-born Hispanics to abuse, and it passed in '84, and then it was overturned by the court, Supreme Court, and state courts. And what was interesting, and I wrote about this in my book, what was interesting about 187 was its aftermath, and that was that it became sort of a rallying cry against the sort of exclusionary policies that the Republicans advocated. Now, when 187 was on the ballot, it helped get Pete Wilson, a Republican governor from San Diego, it helped him get reelected, but that was it. He never won another race. The Republican Party basically has gone out of business in California, and you can trace its trend toward irrelevancy with 187 and that sentiment. So right now, there's not a single Republican statewide office holder in California. The last one was Arnold Schwarzenegger, and a lot of Republicans didn't even think he was a real Republican.
Yeah.
And the Republican candidates who've been trying to insert themselves or run, let's be fair, for our open statewide seats, the governorship, and also for the mayor's race in Los Angeles, they, were singing sort of the Prop 187 song, and they've been just slaughtered. The last poll that I think my newspaper, the LA Times, posted today, or maybe overnight, showed that Xavier Becerra, who's the Democratic candidate for governor in the November election, has basically a 66-33 margin over his Republican challenger, who's just not going to be a factor. So
yeah.
So that's what's right now we're in a progressive era, but the Republicans have just not had an answer really in almost a half century. So this is a Democratic state because a majority of Californians appreciate sort of Democratic policies, and there's nothing in their way of voting. It's another factor that I point to here, that this is a state in which if you're registered to vote and you want to vote, absolutely nothing stands in your way. You vote. You can vote by mail. Everybody gets a ballot in the mail. When I send mine in, I get an email from my county telling me that, they know I've mailed it. I get an email when they receive it. I get an email when it's counted. So this is the way we do it. We don't put restrictions on hours. We don't try to, throw people off the rolls.
Yeah.
So California politicians know what their voters are thinking and want.
And let me ask you this, because we're talking about this in long-term trends. California some people might not know this because some time has passed, but Nixon, right, came from California. Reagan was the governor of California. Reagan passed my understanding, the first modern gun control bill, because he was afraid of the Black Panthers in California at the time. And so you had these two significant actors of U.S. history are from there. Their politics went national.
No, finish your thought.
Yeah.
But what I write about them is that, Nixon and Reagan are sort of artifacts of this vacillation of California political values that we've seen going, much further back. I mean, Nixon and Reagan are their modern exemplars. But if you go back further in time, you see conservatives, reactionaries, racist bigots coming, basically bubbling to the top in California politics. And what I wrote about Nixon and Reagan to sort of, explain this trend line is that when they ran for office and won, they were not outliers in terms of California's political coloration. They represented a clear majority of voters. Nixon ran on an anti-communist platform at first, very viciously so. And Reagan, he discovered, his campaign managers, said later that, Reagan didn't really care about like the universities in Berkeley, but when he was going around the state giving talks, he kept getting questions about the mess at Berkeley. And this was the time when students at Berkeley were basically protesting and holding
during civil rights and Vietnam.
Civil rights, anti-Vietnam, all this stuff. And what was unfolding at the University of California was sort of, disturbed liberals, conservatives, and independents alike, but for different reasons and in different ways. And Reagan, his people said, we're getting a lot of questions about Berkeley. You should say something. And so Reagan went to war with the students at Berkeley and rode that to the governorship 2 terms. Nixon had, rode his block to first a seat in Congress and then the Senate, though he could not. He tried to run for governor and lost, or he ran for governor and lost. So that was. But he became president based on, and certainly in part, on the policies that he pursued while he was representing California.
How does the history sort of Spanish incursions in the Alta California and the devastation inflicted on native peoples by Europeans, how does that history shape where California is now, where the nation is now?
Well, we see echoes of mistreatment of basically indigenous people and migrants throughout California history. But although, I will say that the view of that era that we teach to school children and that we sort of inculcated as part of the California pageant has changed over the years, particularly recently, because of research into things like the Indian genocide and the mistreatment of indigenous people by the missionaries who had come from Spain. And, though I can quickly tell a story on myself. When I was going around the state giving talks about my book, there was one at which I raised the question of what do we think about the missionary era now, which is so much a part of our our sort of received history, and people in the audience who had kids, who had raised kids in California said, "Oh yeah, when our kids were in fourth grade, we all they had to build a mission." And and of course the mothers in the room would say, yeah, well, I had to build it, I mean, I had to do it for them. And you would buy cubes of sugar and you would put them together. And I went home after one of these meetings and I said to my wife, boy, this is curious. These people were telling me about having to do this with their kids. She looked at me like I was a complete idiot and said, you raised your children in California and they both had to do that. But I had to do it, and you didn't even know. So anyway, but certainly we've seen a reconsideration. When the mission movement, which is actually sort of a 20th century movement, people, in fact, an editor at the LA Times who was a history buff got irritated that so many of the missions in California had fallen into disrepair, that he started this movement to raise money to rebuild them and fix them up. And to do that, he had to sort of paint a picture of the missionaries as these, uplifting, good people who brought civilization and religion and morality to the indigenous Indians. And that's how that idea got spread. But we don't think of that quite that way anymore.
Yeah. And I think there's probably been a wholesale reevaluation of the treatment of indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, particularly.
Right. Now, I will say that in California, you will see, and every community has a Junipero street or a Serra, street, in honor of the Franciscan monks who were leaders of the mission building.
What if I were to ask? I mean, what do you think people outside of California? Most people, when they think of California, they think of the beaches. They think wealthy people and movies and stars. What do people get wrong? What is the most common mistake that, and I imagine there might be many, but there's, for instance, there's always this belief that everyone in California is rich and, you got these beautiful highways, right? And it's sort of this gateway to, I don't know, just to American beauty and American promise. Why don't you speak to that?
Well, I think the view that a lot of people, I don't know if it's most, but it's certainly many, outside California have of California is that it's a land, as you said, of milk and honey, and also weirdos. And, the line that's been attributed to everyone from Mark Twain to our former late Senator Alan Cranston about how, God tipped America on its side and all of the loose nuts, rolled into California, something of that nature. So, Hollywood, of course, has communicated an image of middle class, complacency, I think, or satisfaction, or just joy. That's, very California, has a very Californian basis. Silicon Valley, this is a real phenomenon, and it's an echt California phenomenon that no other state, no other country has been able to match. But that being said, I write sort of in the introduction to my book about how when I first moved to California, I had this image, free love, free drugs, find your fortune, and took an apartment that looked on the map as though it was walking distance to the beach. And first weekend, I got a beach chair and I walked down to it, and I discovered, first of all, it's not that close. It was, like more, a mile or maybe more to get to the water. And when I got there, I discovered, I lived in Long Beach. I discovered that I was dipping my toes, not on the Pacific Ocean, but in the port of Long Beach, and it was sort of this gross water. And it was, and that's when, your dreams meet reality. And sometimes it can be disturbing. And also that Long Beach, for all that I thought that California was this wild, unique place, Long Beach as a community had, the reputation of being, as they called it, Iowa by the sea. And that's because so many Midwesterners come and they brought their, their values and their lifestyles to California. Now, that being said, the fact of the matter is that 1 out of every 8 Americans lives in California. And that what that tells you is that California is America. And the way I put it in my book is to understand America, you have to understand California. And if you understand California, you have a good shot at understanding America. And that's true. And that, explains some of this interplay between values that are inculcated or raised or created or perfected in California, spread so easily to the rest of the land.
Michael, how is, since Donald Trump came down the golden escalator at Trump Tower in 2015, how has California's identity, or has it, changed? Because the president has made clear that he believes that he would like to do things that harm the state at a policy level. He's made that clear and has done so. California, I believe, also has, was it the 5th largest economy in the world?
Sometimes it's the 4th, sometimes
the fourth, the 4th,
the 6th. But it's up there. Yeah.
But it's up there, and so the question is what is? I'm not asking you to get in Donald Trump's mind, but what is what is going on in California? Again, not Republicans, but Californians seeing what's going on. If you can maybe speak to this, because he is making their state. He's saying everything wrong with the U.S. Look at California. While California, if you look,
all I can say is bless his heart. I mean, look, Trump came into power at a time that we're still in, when California was experiencing a progressive. A reliance on progressive values. And that's because California saw things like immigration to be, an economic boon, not a threat. We live with immigrants, legal and illegal. They cut our lawns, they raise our children, they work in our offices. Sometimes they're our bosses. So when Trump came in and started spouting his anti-immigrant spiel and challenging policies, including our environmental policies, he was really cutting against the grain of what Californians had come to value and appreciate about the way they lived and their politics. And our politicians, as I said, are never in any doubt about what their constituents think about anything, because nothing's in the way of voters expressing their opinion. The attacks by Trump and his, MAGA cronies on California, they don't persuade anybody in California that they know what they're doing. And, as it happens, we have politicians who've chosen to fight Trump head on. Gavin Newsom, sort of had this very interesting evolution in his treatment of Trump, toward the beginning of last year, when Trump first started his second term, Newsom, who was seen even then as, a very viable presidential candidate in 28, did this thing where he set up a podcast and he would reach out to conservatives and have them on and talk with them. Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, and a lot of people in the Democratic Party, and I think maybe independents as well, said, well, what is he doing? I mean, nobody wants this, But then once Trump really started, hammering, federal funds for California, hammering DEI, hammering transgender treatments and abortion and medical treatments, I think you have to say that Newsom rose to the occasion and he fought back, and he's fought back vigorously. And, I think voters appreciate that. Now, I'm not saying that he's a shoo-in for the presidential nomination, because, the Democrats have quite a few other viable candidates who would beg to differ. But, Newsom has not really, in the last year and a half or so, been shy about saying, claiming that, he represents California values. And I think he's making a fair point.
What do you, Michael, let's take the lens now from California and expand nationally. You've been writing about these issues for decades. What do you believe is the current state of American democracy?
Well, I think it's stronger than people give it credit for, and I think what the reason that people are often mistaken about this is that the followers of Trump are a pretty small block, much smaller than you think, and it's shrinking every day, but it's loud, and it tends to be
very loud.
It's very loud, and it tends to be sort of concentrated outlets like Fox and and what have you, that sort of gives people the impression that Trump is stronger than he really is. But now, I think we've seen Republicans getting their arms around the fact that he's a lame duck, and maybe it's not in their interest to do everything that he wants to do. So I think we'll know more in November, but it's certainly looking like the Democrats are going to be in a good position when that election is over. And then I think the entire political complexion of the country changes if the Democrats win one, and certainly if they win both chambers on Capitol Hill. You will just see Trump collapse. I get asked, fairly often, what do I think is going to be Trumpism after Trump? And my answer to that is, I think it's unmistakable that it disappears. And if you want an example, just look at what's happened to Turning Point USA, which was Charlie Kirk's vehicle, and when he died and disappeared, no one pays attention to it
anymore. And I think right. I mean, I think after Trump, there's not, Trump, similar to Vladimir Putin and other autocrats, has made it. So there's really no one really waiting in the wings because.
No, I don't think the Republicans have a very deep bench.
No.
And basically they're depleting their bench by running, by choosing the most MAGA heavy candidates. And I'm not a political expert, and I thought both Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris were going to win, at a walk, and and obviously I was wrong. But I think you have to look at Trump as a unique political character for America, and that I don't think he can communicate.
How does I'm curious. Let's bring it back to business. Let's bring it back to business. The tariffs, starting with I think it was called Liberation Day, in April 25. I think it was April 25 was when
April 2nd, yeah.
Yeah, April 2nd, 2025. The president said, "I am going." In paraphrasing, he said, "I am going to issue these tariffs, and American prosperity is going to it's going to be like nothing ever seen before." I think is more or less paraphrasing. Michael, is that the case?
You mean, did what he predicted come
Yeah.
true?
Well,
I think at the time that he was saying this, economists and trade experts said there's no way that's going to be true. The math that was involved in the creation of these tariffs was suspect. And as we look back, and I wrote a column on this just the other day, that the manufacturing recovery that he promised has gone in reverse.
Because there was under Biden, there was you did see manufacturing in the U.S. You saw that curve going up, and then under Trump with these tariffs, he's basically punishing American consumers, right? And
I mean, you can't argue the fact that consumers pay these bills, and importers actually get the invoices and they pass it on. So no, the tariffs. I mean, of course, part of the problem with Trump's approach to tariffs is that you don't know, what they are, because he announces them and then he rescinds them within a matter of days, and that's really one of the things that makes his policy so damaging, is that no business, I mean, businesses can accommodate, a low tariff regime, and they can accommodate a high tariff regime as long as it's the regime. But what they can't deal with is not knowing where they are. And when that happens, they stop investing because they don't know where to put their investments. So we need all this to go away before we get real, I think we get back on the path to job growth.
I imagine you're following, or somewhat following, what's happening in Iran. The president attacked Iran February 28th, 2026. Iran then immediately stopped traffic on the Strait of Hormuz. All they had to do was say, "We're going to put a mine, and insurance, global insurance becomes too expensive." And we're seeing a glut. Not a glut. We're seeing our strategic reserve go down, down, down. And there's a lot of reports that there are serious concerns about the economy because of the role fossil fuels play as an input. Michael, can you speak to that? Are you concerned, or of elevated concern about what's happening in Hormuz as it relates to the U.S. and obviously global economy?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, we already know that this is, possibly the worst strategic blunder, foreign policy blunder that America's ever engaged in. In every respect, we are in a worse situation vis-a-vis Iran than we were on February 27th, the day before he started this adventure. They may be closer to a nuclear weapon, though I don't think they're very close. They have the stranglehold over this important waterway for the not only shipment of crude, but a lot of other commodities, cement, fruits and vegetables, and things like that. And it's clear he wants to get out of it, but doesn't know how and can't.
Yeah.
So when this began, wearing my hat as sort of a stock market maven, I said basically the stock market's going to trade within a range, and until this is really finally resolved, and that's exactly what's happened. So I think everybody, investors think that eventually this too shall pass. They just don't know when, and is there going to be lasting damage that takes place between now and then? But everybody wants out of this. So somebody basically needs to tell Trump to put a sock in it, and and actually get some real diplomatic negotiators in there to talk with Iran, not these,
not these
who are
dilettantes.
related to him.
Yeah,
cronies.
Jared Kushner and his real
And Steve Witkoff. Yeah,
yeah,
they're just bozos. So we know they are.
And I let me ask you a California history question, because I'd be very curious to hear your answer to this. The former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, California lawmaker, he was a very powerful lawmaker in the House, and in after January 6th, I recall there's a photograph of the former speaker. He's at Mar-a-Lago, and he's with the president right after he incited an attack on the U.S. Capitol, and sort of doing a thumbs up because he really wanted to be the speaker. Eventually, I think after 14 votes, he becomes a speaker, but it doesn't last too long. And if history remembers former Speaker McCarthy, Michael, how will he be remembered?
Well, I think he'll probably be remembered as a bozo. He was, he was not very intelligent, although, you have to give him credit. He ran consistently, saw off his political opponents in Bakersfield, and that part of the state over and over again. So he knew how to do something. I think in terms of his standing more generally, he was very good at fundraising, and that gave him a tremendous amount of power in the House. But it ran out. He got out maggot, I think. But he did okay, on Capitol Hill when he was pushing policies that were not, were not as inimical to human values as the current policies are. So he lasted for a while, I guess, I haven't covered Congress, but I guess he was able to to get some things done. But he's gone. Nobody even thinks of him anymore.
Yes.
He was it's not like he was, Sam Rayburn,
why is that though, Michael? Why is it this person's sucked up all this attention? Because we were just talking about this with Trump, right? Sucks up all this attention, right? And now McCarthy, it's not even that long. I mean, it really isn't that long since he left, and people probably, even I'm sure in his district, people have forgotten who he was.
Well, I think it's, the error that people make is confusing the office with the person. And, from everything I've heard, McCarthy was a, perfectly friendly guy, and you could sort of, have a beer with him, I guess, is the trope. But his power really, the bottom line was it descended from the fact that he was Speaker of the House. And when he was no longer Speaker of the House, he's a non-entity. And I think Mike Johnson, who if possible is even worse at doing his job than McCarthy was, is going to discover that pretty smartly.
Let's talk about water, because water really figures prominently in the history of California, and it's also figuring prominently in the history of the West and also the United States and world. Now, can you speak to that and how maybe we can possibly analogize some of the struggles for water that happened historically in California to this day in the West, and analogize to this present moment of a genuine climate crisis?
Yeah, well, The story of California water, dates back to water rights that some of which were granted to landowners in the 19th century, and they were granted in terms. There was sort of a fluctuation in water legal doctrine, in which California came up with sort of a unique arrangement, but basically, California doctrine sort of allowed the creation of these large water right holdings that were distant from the water itself. So we built canals and aqueducts, and I think there was a line that I use in my book, quoting a well-known hydrologist, that in California, water it has never been where the people are, and the choice was made not to bring the people to the water, but bring the water to the people. And it's very expensive, but it's resulted in some extremely elaborate engineering achievements here. But basically, it's led to a situation which is, always fighting over water, because the interests of all of the users are at odds. The growers want water, want cheap water to irrigate. The city dwellers, residents, want cheap water to basically fill their bathtubs and showers and swimming pools and to drink. And then you have the environmental community, which says, you can't simply drain all the rivers until they're dry beds, because you're ruining the environment. And not only that, you're costing industries that relied on that water a tremendous amount and putting them out of business. And in that respect, I talk about the salmon fishery, which is basically disappeared because there's no water in the rivers that the salmon spawn in. So basically, the task is to balance these three interests in a way that everybody is served and everybody compromises. And there we are. It's just been very difficult to do, in part because the sources of California water are varied. I mean, we get a lot of water from the Colorado River because we built Hoover Dam, which is the border between Arizona and Nevada. But most of the water comes here to California because California growers basically paid to build the dam, and they did it by promising to buy the electricity that would be generated in the reservoir. So this is, I write in my book that, California has a lot of problems, and they are precursors and they're indicators and pointers to problems that will spread. But California is also trying, not always successfully, to solve those problems, even though some of the problems are of our own making. So it's very complicated. It's like saying, well, how do you solve the homeless problem? It's, you have a situation where there's so many causes, so many different things going on, that if you really try to do it by pinpointing one, either, having growers fallow their fields, or having urban residents take out their lawns, or what have you, you're not going to solve it, because there's always more coming on. So it's going to take time. At this stage, we don't know what the solution will be. It's just that there has to be one. And with global warming, yes, the prospects of a soft landing in California's water crisis recedes more and more all the time.
Let me ask you, because this is a California question. This is also a national, international question, and I'm sure you know about this. So right now, the Magnificent Seven, right? These are, if I recall, they're the seven. They're seven firms in the Fortune 500, and they make up, I think, 30% of all revenue, and something like 30% of all revenue in the Fortune 500. These firms, so they're heavily concentrated. And my understanding is that these firms loan each other money with letters of credit back and forth. All right. And there are talks now. You have talks by Sam Altman, and I don't know what the status of these conversations of discussing being owned by the federal government, and some have suggested, is this a bailout, right? And so much of our present prosperity is really, I think, baked in AI, right? LLMs. What do you have any thoughts on that? The fact that so much capital is concentrated in these AI firms that are all doing loans to one another, that if one has a challenge with meeting obligations, that potentially could lead to a cascade?
Well, yes. The seven stocks that the Magnificent Seven right now, and I've got the list up on my screen. It's Tesla, Meta, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Google. And they're not all AI-driven companies, so they all, sort of, wear an AI banner as sort of a marketing device. And that, I should tell you that my take on AI generally is that it's somewhere north of 90% bull. It's a marketing label. I've tried to persuade my colleagues to stop sort of allowing entrepreneurs to claim that they're doing AI, and that if we ever mention AI in a story, we shouldn't do it unless we can explain what is it about this thing that's AI, because almost all the time there's nothing AI about it. I've been covering technology for decades, and I've seen marketing claims come and go, and I think I wrote my first story about AI 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And I've just covered that field, and I know that the claims that are being made for it today are exactly the same claims that were made for it in the 60s, and those didn't come true, and these are not going to come true either. So, but it is true, you do put your finger on an important thing, which is that the big hyperscaler AI companies, and we're talking about NVIDIA to a certain extent, Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, are engaged in this sort of circular finance, or there's a term I could use that I don't know would be appropriate, but in which, right, they make deals with each other to buy each other's products, and then they take back, the money that they supposedly are spending on that in some sort of trade credit, and yes, and I think more and more investors and investment analysts are looking at that and saying, this is a game of musical chairs, and at some point somebody's going to be left without a chair, and then no one will have a chair. And I think, we have already seen a couple of moments when, all of the AI hyperscalers fall off a cliff at the same moment, but then they come back. So, I've seen conditions like this before. We saw this in the .com era, when everybody claimed that they were going to be changing the world, so they should be given as much capital as they can, and then it turns out not to be true. The question is, do these companies have as much weight in the market, have so much weight in the market that when they start to fall over, it's going to be bad for the market? And I think there's a lot of concern about that, but that the more there's concern about it, the more we're going to see the stock prices of these companies drift down. In fact, you could look at, the biggest AI play of the last month, which is SpaceX.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
which is now trading below, or I don't know if it still is today, or it closed today, but it's trading below its IPO price just a month ago, which means that everybody who bought the stock is in the red. And that's in part because the AI story for SpaceX just doesn't seem to hold much water.
And so, and what, I mean, looking ahead, what do you think is the future? If you could prognosticate a little, I know people don't like to, but what do you think is the future of, let's say, California 25 years from now? Where do you think the Golden State? Where do you think it's going to go?
Well, I wrote a column. I wrote a couple of columns a while ago about a couple of articles that appeared in the Atlantic, I think a year or two ago, that proclaimed the end of the California dream. And I wrote that, not this again. We've been reading stories proclaiming the end of the California dream. I traced the earliest one to 1848.
Oh, wow.
So, and there's always somebody out there saying it's going to end. It can't continue this way, and somehow it just continues. And that's, I think, to a certain extent, because California reached a critical mass in some of these industries that it's hard to
recreate that anywhere else.
Well, it's hard to recreate that, and it's hard to challenge. Now, some industries it's not working out so well. In Hollywood, we're losing, a lot of business to other states and other countries, so production in Hollywood has, fallen off to a really serious level. But on the other hand, Silicon Valley, which has this sort of unique compound of capital and publicity and engineering skill and marketing ability, there's never been a challenge for Silicon Valley. And every time, Silicon Valley marches, up to the edge of something and it doesn't work, something else seems to be in the offing. So, I look at some of these industries and say, it's mostly, sloganeering, humanoid robots. We have, tons of companies building humanoid robots. And I've written and quoted experts saying, you don't want a robot in your house that walks on 2 feet, because if it falls over, it's going to fall on you and kill you. Yeah, but
what about those that do the dishes or like they?
All right. What about the ones? What I've found and what I've tried to inculcate in some of my colleagues who write about this is that every single company that's building a humanoid robot puts out a demo of the robot doing something, and it's always doing the same thing, which is folding laundry.
Right.
So these humanoid robots can fold laundry, and now you're seeing more, taking dishes out of a dishwasher, or maybe putting dishes into a dishwasher or something. These are basically rote activities that don't require a lot of fine motor skills. And if they don't work, if the sweater isn't folded right, it doesn't matter. And if the robot drops a teacup trying to put it or take it out of a dishwasher, it's a lost teacup. But when you really want these things doing more important tasks, like caring for invalids in their homes, then you don't want something that walks around like a human being. You want something on wheels that's got abilities that are specified. And but we're going, we're seeing a lot, we got a human, and they all, fill dishwashers, and they all fold laundry. And I'm not joking. I mean, every one of them folds laundry, and this is supposed to be a great achievement, but they don't do the things that we're going to need them to do.
Let me ask you, this is fun, Michael. It's really been an honor to have you on and talk. If we can just put Michael's Golden State up, so people can see the book, and this could obviously be bought at any bookstore, Amazon, any place books are sold.
In fact, I should mention that, this is timely because the paperback edition of this book will be out on August 11th.
Okay, August 11th.
3 weeks from now.
3 weeks from now. Okay, that's great. Let me ask you, Michael, final question. If you were giving advice to a young person, let's say someone, maybe they're entering university as a freshman or they're going to graduate school, what advice would you give them, encourage them to think about as they sort of enter life and, get experience?
Well, all I can say is that I was an English major.
Oh.
And when I graduated from college, I went to journalism school, which was 1 year, and then, as we all knew would happen, I learned more in my first 3 days, working for a newspaper than I learned in a year. Although I had a very good teacher at journalism school, a brilliant teacher. But anyway, I'd say, look, STEM is supposed to be, the path to success, science, technology, engineering, and math. But we've also seen now engineers losing their jobs.
Yeah.
So, what I would say is, follow your instincts, but get a broad education, so that you can call on sort of, culture to lead you to the next place. And if you're good at math and and you have an engineering bent and you want to be a doctor or a scientist, we need them. And but we also need them to sort of have a grounding in culture.
Culture, humanities. Well,
Culture and humanities.
Michael, it was a great honor to have you on today.
Well, it's nice of you to say. I really appreciate that.
And and to speak about all your works. And please, I think August 11th, 2026, the paperback of Golden State, the history, the making of California, it's a history of California, very good. Michael, we'd love to have you back to talk about all manners of things.
Anytime.
And it was great to speak with you today.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. It's been great. I really enjoyed this.